Hey guys, I am Tamika and I am here to share a story with you today. And that story is why I left my sorority and never looked back. Now, this story starts in October 2001. I was a freshman in college and I wasn't looking to join any Greek letter organizations at the time. But because I was considered legacy, I was basically grandfathered in to Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated. My mom was a Zeta, and my dad was a member of Phi Beta Sigma, which is the brother fraternity of the Zetas. So I ended up pledging my life to Zeta Phi Beta Sorority. And I did it for two main reasons. For one, because I wanted to gain my parents' approval because I thought it would be something that would make them proud because it was something that they did. Um, and also, I was actually told that it would look good on your resume. And, being a new college student, being a freshman in college, I was doing everything that I could to make sure that I built up my resume so that when I graduated, I'd be able to get a job. So when you say that, it made it sound good, right? Well, there was also the community service aspect of it, and community service always looks good. Um, but hazing wasn't allowed, and hazing is kind of a process where you go through a lot of unnecessary things. Like some people are beat um, with wooden paddles. Some people, you might have to drink things, get drunk. There's a lot of different hazing processes, but hazing is actually not legally allowed. And when we joined the organization, we had to sign paperwork stating that it wouldn't be done. And if it was, there would be consequences, which could include the entire organization being suspended from the campus, from the school. So, but as things go, hazing still went on. And that was the first red flag for me because I didn't understand at the time why we had to go through these seemingly unnecessary things just to join the organization. I personally felt like there were better ways to create sisterhood other than through trauma bonding, which is basically what hazing is. But I still found myself at the interest meeting for the organization thinking of how excited my parents would be once they found out that I made the decision to follow in their footsteps. Um, Fast forward through the process that they took us to, I literally thought about quitting every single day because for me it was just so unnecessary and it was just agitating and it was unnecessary. Sometimes for me it even felt like torture because I just didn't understand it. I didn't understand what that had to do with anything. So besides the education part, learning about the organization, learning about its history, learning about its purpose, the types of things that they get involved in, like I mentioned community service before. For instance, Zeta works with the March of Dimes, which I thought was great. But and that part I understood. But the rest of it I could definitely have gone without. But then we got to our Hell Night, as they called it, which was the last night of our pledging process. A night of unnecessary agitation and provocation and making you do things you wouldn't normally do or say things you wouldn't normally say. Just a lot of unnecessariness, for lack of a better word. But what really stood out to me about my whole journey through Zeta was the crossing ceremony, which was the initiation ritual that symbolizes the pledge, the person pledging, crossing the burning sands and being fully accepted as a member of the organization. So that was the part of the story that gets really interesting. Now, I don't remember how long the ritual itself lasted, but what I remember is being very uncomfortable and feeling very out of place the entire time that it was going on. And nothing that was happening sat right with me. And I didn't understand why. I just didn't know why. I thought it was just me, and I thought it was just because it was new to me. Maybe it was just that nerves. I don't know. But just as a side note, I'm a preacher's kid, and I grew up in church. I read the Bible often, so for a while after I left the organization, I started to feel shame. I felt ashamed because I felt like I should have known better. I felt like I should have been able to discern that the rituals and the processes that I went through were not of God. And I want to add here, in the Bible, in Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, it says, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge." It says, and this is God talking, it says, "Because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being priests for me. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children." Now, why would God be so harsh in this verse? Why would he threaten to not only turn away from the people he was talking to, but also from their children? It's because these types of rituals that people go through are actual covenants or lifelong agreements that we make with other gods, little g God. And God lets us know in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, where you will find the 10 commandments. The very first commandment, God lets us know that we are not to have any other gods before him. And the Bible teaches us that God takes covenants very seriously. So much so that there are many examples in the Bible where even if people made the wrong covenant, or a covenant that he had specifically told them not to make with someone because of, for whatever reason, he still honored the covenant because he takes it seriously, even though he knew that those covenants would destroy his people. He still honored the covenant. So what does that have to do with Greek sororities and fraternities, you ask? Let's keep going. So nowhere in the Bible does it say that we are allowed to make covenants with any other deity besides God himself. So when you take the time to actually do research into these organizations, which I strongly encourage all of you to do, you'll see that these organizations in a lot of different ways make tributes to other gods. For instance, if you look at the shields of some of the organizations, there are actual gods on their shields that the whole organization is a tribute to. That's not good. So, but these organizations make tributes to other gods, even while claiming to acknowledge God himself. Because I'll get into the ritual in a little bit in just a minute, but during the ritual, we actually had a Bible and we were reading scripture. So, like I said, I remember that there was scripture being quoted during the initiation ritual, but in some cases, what I personally noticed was that God's actual name wasn't being used in some cases. And the context that the scriptures were being read in was so broad that really any name could be fit into it other than God's name. And I know this is a detail that a lot of people wouldn't really notice or pay attention to, but because, I was a preacher's kid, and like I said, I read the Bible often, and I grew up in such close proximity to the Word of God, I knew something was off, and it bothered me. So back to the ritual. A few of the things that stood out to me about the actual ritual, a few of the things that set me on edge was the white attire. We were required to wear all white. The marching in, we marched in a line, real slow, real quiet. It was a very solemn time. The room was dim, or dark. We carried candles. Each of us was given a flower that we were required to carry with us as we marched in, and then we left it at the altar. they had set up after we all knelt down and prayed. And oddly enough, another thing that stood out to me was the fact that we were given Bibles, monogrammed with each of our names on it. And I just thought that was weird because the Bible just seemed so out of place. The way that I felt on the inside, the Bible just felt so out of place in that situation for me. And there was also the fact that throughout the whole process, throughout the whole ritual process, there was I felt this heavy feeling, like really like something was happening that I shouldn't have been a part of. But I couldn't explain it. I didn't know if it was just me. I just didn't know. And back then, I didn't know enough about the occult to recognize any of these things as red flags. But what I learned years later is that white is a color that's used a lot in the occult. The actual altar that we knelt down and prayed at symbolized the spiritual demonic altars that we were entering into covenant with, and the spirits that govern those altars. The flower we left on the altar was a sacrifice for those spirits. You know, there was the darkness, the candles, all occult related. But I didn't know. And this was a very good example of how deceiving the phrase is, what you don't know won't hurt you. Well, the reality is what you don't know can kill you because you don't know. So, and you know, it can kill you spiritually, especially, as was the case here with these rituals. You know, none of us died during the ritual, but there was spiritual death. There were spiritual ramifications that we weren't aware of at the time. So it was October 20th, 2001 that I pledged my life to false gods, unknowingly. And even after that day, I just never felt right about my sorority. It was just something that was always off for me. And as a part of the ritual as well, we all declared that once we became a Zeta, we were always going to be a Zeta, and we would only be separated by death. Well, that stood out to me too, because that's an oath. That's a declaration. And from that day, Matthew chapter 5 verses 33 to 37 came to my remembrance way more often than I liked. And I'm not going to read it here, but if you want to go back and look at it, that's Matthew chapter 5 verses 33 and 37. And in these verses, Jesus is talking about oaths and he's forbidding people to make any oaths to anyone or anything other than God. So me personally, whenever I wore that Greek paraphernalia, whether it be a shirt or jacket or even a bracelet, I was reminded of the oaths that I made that day that had nothing to do with God. Because number one, these are secret organizations. There are a lot of things that are kept under wraps in these organizations that you're just not allowed to talk about. They're secret societies. God doesn't run secret societies. God is not a God of darkness. He doesn't do anything under a cloud of darkness. That's just not how he operates. So, you know, God is light. God illuminates everything. God exposes. God brings things out. And these societies, they're doing the exact opposite. They're pulling things in. They're keeping things in. They have their own set of rules over here that they go by that nobody can know anything about. They have these like the rituals. The rituals aren't things that they advertise. You don't know what's happening in that ritual unless you're a part of the ritual. Making oaths, and it's not of God. It has nothing to do with God. And my heart was convicted. And I didn't know it at the time. I didn't recognize the feeling at the time, so I couldn't put words to it. But my heart was actually grieved. I was feeling conviction for what I had done in my ignorance. So fast forward to 2005, I had switched colleges, and I had a new group of friends by that time, and a good bit of them were other Zetas and other Sigmas. And one Sigma in particular I had become pretty close with at the time. And we were at a party one night, and he confided in me that he was called to be a pastor. Now, at that time, I didn't know that I was a prophet. I didn't know. God hadn't called me out on it yet, at least not that I remember. And I didn't know much about prophets or prophecy or anything like that. But I prophesied to him that night at that party that he would not be able to fully walk in his calling until he let Sigma go, until he let that fraternity go. Excuse me. And until he did, he would not move forward. And besides the fact that I didn't know why I was saying those words, I didn't know where those words were coming from or why I felt so compelled to say them to him, even though they sounded crazy to me. I realized that in that same moment that I was feeling very strong conviction myself. And that conviction never let up after that day. I had to deal with it ever since then. So the very next year in October 2006, I rededicated my life to the Lord at a deliverance conference. And I was very surprised when the first instruction that God immediately gave me was to come out of Zeta Phi Beta and put it behind me for good. And even though I didn't know why he was saying what he was saying, even though I didn't know why he wanted me to do it, I obeyed. And looking back later, I realized that God had called me out of that sorority almost 5 years to the day that I pledged my life to it. And I know that 5 is the number that symbolizes God's grace. And it was in his grace, by the grace of God, that he did not let me continue on in my ignorance. So not long after I renounced Zeta, a family member actually called me, kind of out of the blue, and began to explain to me the history of these secret organizations, of these Greek sororities and fraternities. He was, and the Masons, which are also involved, which I also didn't know at the time. And my dad is also a Mason, but he was considering, my family member was considering pledging himself. And instead of pledging, though, he decided to do some research first. So as he began to research, he started uncovering a lot of things about these organizations. And the more he learned, the more disgusted he became with what he was learning. And so he remembered that I had also pledged a great organization, so he called me to see if I knew what I got myself into. And when he started to tell me these things, I was speechless. I had no clue what I had done and what I had joined myself to. I had no idea. So up until that point, I had been holding on to a lot of the Greek paraphernalia that I still had, the jackets, the shirts. I even had a pair of slippers, monogram with the letters and all that stuff. I got rid of it. And really, honestly, if I'm being honest, the only reason I was even holding on to it at that point is because I had gotten used to the popularity and the recognition of being a part of the organization, and I didn't really want to let it go. But after that conversation that day, I went home and I threw it all out. Didn't give it a second thought, threw it all in the trash. And I made a decision that I would not put anything else over God. I would not make anything else greater than God in my life. I didn't want to do that. And since that day, I haven't looked back or second guessed my decision. And the only other thing that gave me pause at the beginning was the thought of losing some of the connections that I made with a lot of phenomenal people along the journey. And I mean, it just is what it is. Some of those people I'm not in contact with today, some I still am, but I would make the decision all over again if it meant choosing God first. I would do it all over again, because God and God alone is my source and my true love, and I will never put anything over him intentionally. So why am I sharing this story with you? Because for years, over the years, I have seen more and more people starting to wake up to the reality that we made a mistake. That I've seen more and more people are making the choice to choose God over these organizations. And I know that the more that these types of stories are told, the more people will continue waking up and continue choosing God. And, will everybody wake up? Probably not. But the ones who will make the choice to return to God and to come out of these places are worth the time that it takes to share the stories. So what's the takeaway of my story today? Well, it's that if there's anyone who's ever felt the conviction of joining these groups, the rituals, anyone who's had second thoughts, anyone who's had moments where anything about the organization just hasn't sat right in their hearts, hasn't sat right with them. I hope that you will hear the word of the Lord today and come out now. Get out now while you still have time. God is calling people out of the places where they have been bound in this moment. And as a prophet of the Lord, since 2022 began, I have prophesied many times that 2022 is the year that many of us will come into alignment, or in some cases come back into alignment with the heart of God. And he is calling us into deeper relationship with him. He is calling us out of the places where we have been held captive, where we have been bound, where we have been stuck. And he's calling us back to him. He's calling us into a place of intimacy in his heart. And since March has begun, we're only in the third month of the year now, but I have already personally seen how God is moving on the hearts of a lot of his people. And it's so encouraging. He's working right now to prepare the bride for the bridegroom who is yet to come. So my message to you, let's get our hearts in alignment with God. Let's start putting him back. Let's start putting away these other gods, these other deities, these other things that we put before him, because it's idolatry. We've entered into idolatry. And if you read in the Old Testament, there was a lot of idolatry going on, and there was a lot of instances where God was calling his people out of idolatry. He's doing it right now still to this day. It's time to be bold. It's time to speak out. It's time to start telling these stories so that other people will come to the point where they will wake up and begin to put God back into his rightful position in their lives. So this is my story of why I left my sorority and never looked back. I'm Tamika Chambers. If you want to hear more from me, I can be found on Instagram at prophetess_TTEE. Thanks for listening.